Hi everyone, I think we'll get started now. So my name is Amandine Denis-Ryan and I'm Head of National Programs at ClimateWorks Australia. Our CEO Anna Skarbek was supposed to be hosting this webinar, but due to some technical difficulties, I'll be taking over. So first, I wanted to welcome you all. We're really delighted to see the level of interest in our work. We filled the 500 people capacity on Zoom in less than 24 hours. And so we are also sharing this event to Facebook Live. I would like to make a special mention to all of our philanthropic supporters and program partners and our colleagues across the sectors who are with us online today. I just wanted to let you know that we really value our partnerships and working together. The support of our work is instrumental. I will also start with some technology points. Please note that this session is being recorded. Please feel free to use the chat on either Zoom or Facebook to let us know who you are and where you are joining us from. We have time dedicated to a Q&A at the end of the session. On Zoom, you can send us your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, please post any questions there in the comments. We might not be able to answer all the questions depending on how many there are, but we'll try to respond to as many as we can. I might start the introduction to the session. Ronnie, if you can go to the next slide. So today we are here to share with you our recently published Decarbonisation Futures analysis, a bit about ClimateWorks Australia if you don't know us. We are a team of 50 staff now, working within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute and funded by philanthropy and some project funding from industry and government. We were established 10 years ago to be a bridge between research and action and act as a trusted advisor for business and government with evidence-based advice focused on solutions and implementation. We specialize in identifying pathways to net zero emissions by 2050 across all sectors of the economy in Australia. And we now also have a team applying this in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The scientific evidence is clear that urgent action is required to achieve this, a five-fold increase in climate action worldwide. And so Decarbonisation Futures is providing evidence to support decision makers in implementing this five-fold increase in action. I might just now start the main part of the presentation. So I will first give you an overview of the key findings of our research, and I will then hand over to Tom Yankos, our senior project manager, who saw the scenario modeling through from beginning to end and the technology update review. And he will uncover a lot of cool progress in that. So for those of you who have followed us over the years, you're probably familiar with our Deep Decarbonisation Pathways work, which we published in 2014. It was the first report which showed how Australia can reach net zero emissions by 2050 domestically. Decarbonisation Futures is an update of this work. Over the last 2 years, we have reviewed technologies available to reduce emissions, looked at what government, businesses and individuals can do to accelerate the development and deployment of those technologies, developed benchmarks of progress for the uptake of those technologies, as well as broader energy and emissions measures, which can provide signposts for decision makers on whether their actions are aligned with the Paris goals. Those benchmarks were developed based on 3 scenarios that we modeled, which all achieve net zero emissions by or before 2050, with transitions compatible with the global goals of 2 and 1.5 degrees of warming. Next slide. In 2015 in Paris, all of the world's governments agreed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. Since then, targets of net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier have become the norm, followed by governments, businesses and investors in Australia and around the world. All Australian states and territories have net zero targets in place. Over 100 countries, investors worth more than $4 trillion, and some of Australia's and the world's largest companies have also committed to this goal. Quite importantly, at the beginning, this was mostly including companies in low-emitting sectors like property and technology, but recently it has extended to high-emitting sectors such as heavy industry and freight, For example, Qantas and Rio Tinto have recently announced net zero targets by 2050. Next slide. I think the slides have dropped. So how do we get to net zero emissions? There are technology solutions which can help remove emissions from our homes and economies. We usually group them under 4 pillars. The first one is energy waste reduction, in particular through energy efficiency and a shift away from energy-intensive products and services. The second one is decarbonizing our electricity grid through 100% renewable electricity. The third one, electrification. So we shift everything we can to electricity and a shift away from fossil fuels to zero or near zero emissions alternatives. And the final pillar is to reduce non-energy emissions as much as possible and offset residual emissions. Next slide. So what does this new research shows? Well, it shows that we can and we must leapfrog to zero emissions technologies by accelerating technology deployment and development. First, we accelerate the deployment of technologies which are already mature or demonstrated. And also in parallel, we accelerate the development and demonstration of emerging technologies in harder to abate sectors so that they are ready to deploy in the next decades. Next slide. The good news is that implementing these actions can not only get Australia on track to net zero, but it can also support efforts to rebuild our economy post-COVID-19, delivering a double win for Australia. A lot of these actions can create jobs immediately, and they create those in sustainable industries which will be better protected from future shocks. Can also deliver immediate benefits to individuals and businesses, such as lower energy bills thanks to energy efficiency improvements, and also improved health outcomes, for example, through lower pollution and better in-home comfort. And finally, it can help Australia increase its self-reliance, as well as build new industries and export markets. Very large opportunities exist, for example, in renewable hydrogen and grid steel and aluminium manufacturing, which could be on par with our existing fossil fuel exports. While we completed most of this work pre the COVID era, we do believe that it's very relevant information to support decisions in the context of green recovery stimulus packages. Next slide. So what has changed since 2014? The most remarkable progress has been achieved in renewables and batteries. Solar installations achieved in 5 years what was meant to take 20. The cost of new wind and solar, even with hours of storage, is now unequivocally lower than the cost of new coal generation. Batteries are now following a similar route. They now cost 80% less than in 2010, and this happened much faster than anyone expected. And this has supported a boom in electric vehicles, or EVs. There are now 3 million electric cars on the road in the world. Quite excitingly, we've also seen a lot of progress in what we call the hard to abate sectors. Sectors like large industry, heavy transport, beef production, where back in 2014, we could not yet imagine a zero emissions future. Well, the extraordinary progress in batteries also means that electrification is now a solution which can be applied to more transport modes. We're now seeing small electric planes enter the market. Short-haul electric ferries are in operation, and it is now also likely that heavy trucks could be electrified in the future. For sectors where it's very expensive or complicated to reduce emissions to zero, we are seeing alternative solutions emerge which can help bypass those pain points. For example, cross-laminated timber can now replace steel and cement in the construction of mid-sized buildings. For example, Brisbane's 10-storey 25 King office tower. Beef can be replaced by plant-based alternatives, which are expected to represent a fairly big share of the market in the future. Next slide. These are just a few examples, and our report reviews all major emission reduction technologies and solutions across sectors. And we have found that the progress achieved in the past 5 years has now closed the technical gap to zero emissions in all sectors. In electricity and buildings, zero emissions is doable with technologies which are already mature or demonstrated, in particular renewables, storage, and energy efficiency. In transport, the solutions are at different levels of maturity depending on the modes. As mentioned before, cars and short-haul transport can be electrified. For long haul, a range of zero emissions fuels are likely to be needed. These include biofuels, especially second and third generation, which don't compete with food production, hydrogen and ammonia produced from renewable electricity, or synthetic fuels. In industry and agriculture, zero-emission solutions are emerging. And in those sectors this decade, we can focus on deploying best practice technologies, for example, in energy and resource efficiency, while ensuring that we are ready to deploy the new technologies when they will be available. And finally, nature-based solutions, such as carbon forestry, can help compensate any residual emissions from other sectors. Next slide. In the last 5 years, one evolution which hasn't been as positive is the trend in global emissions, which have kept increasing over the period. What this means is that we have lost very valuable time, and that the decrease towards zero emissions needs to be a lot steeper than if we had started action 10 or 20 years ago. This graph shows the remaining global carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, updated to the start of 2020. Some of you may not be familiar with the concept of carbon budgets. In short, global temperatures rise based on the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere. The carbon budget corresponds to the cumulative amount of emissions we are allowed to put in the atmosphere before we reach certain temperature thresholds. To have a good chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, the remaining global carbon budget is around 300 gigatons of CO2. It corresponds to 8 years worth of emissions at current rates. For 2 degrees, the remaining global carbon budget is a bit more than 1,000 gigatons CO2. That corresponds to about 26 years worth of emissions at current rates. This shows that we need to start our journey towards zero emissions as soon as possible. The good news is that the technologies are now available to allow us to leapfrog to zero emissions equipment and processes and keep those goals within reach. Next slide. In the rest of my presentation, I will walk through some of our modeling results. We have modeled 3 scenarios for the purpose of this report. First one, 2C Deploy, focuses on the accelerated deployment of demonstration and mature stage technologies, which is achieved in particular through strong policy action. 2C Innovate models technology improvement at the upper bounds of current expectations, with action driven by supportive policy and demand by businesses and individuals. And finally, 1.5C All-In demonstrates how a combination of policy, technological innovation, and business and individual action can limit emissions to a level compatible with a 1.5 degrees increase. All 3 scenarios assume typical economic conditions and so do not include possible structural changes to the Australian economy. So we have not included possible new industries like renewable hydrogen, which we will analyse in our Australian Industry Energy Transition Initiative, a separate project. This analysis was also completed before COVID-19 and does not include any of its impacts. Next slide. What do our scenarios show? Well, they show that Australia can still achieve trajectories compatible with the Paris climate goals. However, it also shows that those trajectories involve very strong emissions reductions this decade. About 50% reduction below 2005 levels in 2030 for the 2 degrees scenarios, and about 75% reduction below 2005 levels for the 1.5 degree scenario. Next slide. What does it look like at the sectoral level? These 3 graphs that you will see shortly. Can we have the next slide, please? These 3 graphs represent emissions by sector for each of the scenarios. The yellow dotted line shows emissions for electricity, which have been counted in the relevant end-use sectors, such as buildings, industry. The red dotted line corresponds to total emissions. There are a number of similarities and differences between the scenarios. In terms of similarities, one of the biggest ones is that all scenarios have much lower residual emissions in 2050 than our 2014 work did. This reflects the progress in technology, which I have discussed before. It's important to note that we were not able to model all the technologies we considered in this report, because in many cases we didn't have enough data on their cost or performance to include them in our model parameters. If we do this work again in 5 years, I would expect that we would then be able to model zero emissions across all sectors by 2050. In the meantime, we have used carbon forestry to compensate for those residual emissions and reach net zero emissions by or before 2050. Other similarities include electricity moves to 100% renewables by 2050 and helps decarbonize other sectors. Electricity, buildings and transport get to zero or near zero emissions. Industry and agriculture have significant residual emissions, which reflects the maturity of the technology solutions. In terms of differences, not all scenarios are going for the same ambition, and our 1.5C all-in scenario is the most ambitious of the three. It achieves net zero by 2035, so 15 years earlier than the other two, and has net negative emissions by 2050, which relies on a large volume of carbon forestry. Another difference is in the actual amount of residual emissions in 2050, which varies by scenario and is lowest for the 1.5C all-in. Some of the big ticket items that are driving those differences are the rate of retirement of coal-powered electricity generation, which is slowest in 2C Innovate, the uptake in industrial carbon capture and storage, which particularly impacts emissions from the gas sector and is dependent on policy assumptions, the shift to lower emissions construction materials, which has a big impact on industry emissions, and the uptake of enteric fermentation treatments, which has a big impact on agriculture emissions. Next slide. All of our scenarios see a much accelerated deployment of emissions reduction technologies compared to what we would expect under business as usual. For example, while the government currently projects that about 1 in 5 cars will be electric by 2030, our scenarios see that about 1 in 2 cars would be electric by 2030 in a 2-degree scenario, and about 3 in 4 cars would be electric by 2030 in a 1.5-degree scenario. Similarly for renewables, while the government currently projects that we will have nearly 50% renewables by 2030, our scenarios see between 70 and 80% of renewables in our electricity generation by 2030. Next slide. In parallel, our scenarios see much accelerated development of emerging solutions, such as renewable hydrogen, second and third generation biofuels, and lab foods or enteric fermentation treatments. These solutions are then deployed at scale after 2030. Next slide. This kind of acceleration will not happen in time without strong action by government, business, and individuals. Governments in particular have a key role to play by developing supportive policies, removing roadblocks, making direct investments, and incentivizing the private sector to invest and act. Businesses also have a critical role to play in aligning their products and services, their operations, their R&D investments, and their procurement to a net zero trajectory. Setting a net zero target can be an important first step in this direction. One thing that is quite important to note is that it's a focus on accelerated deployment for both mature and demonstrated technologies. Deployment is what has enabled the recent progress we have seen in renewables and batteries, where economies of scale have driven very large cost savings. Improvements have also been driven by engineering solutions and competitiveness between providers. Next slide. So finally, to conclude my section, in short, after missing our chance to start reducing emissions in the last decade, which was the critical decade for climate change, we have now entered the transformational decade. In order to stay within the global 1.5 and 2 degrees climate goals, emissions need to head towards zero at a steep pace. The good news is that we can do this by accelerating the deployment and development of available technologies to leapfrog to zero emission solutions. So I will now hand over to my colleague Tom, who will take you through some more detailed explanations of our sectoral analysis. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amandine. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you very much for joining. My name's Tom Yankos. I'm a Senior Project Manager here at ClimateWorks Australia, and I'll be taking you through some of the detailed sectoral findings from Decarbonisation Futures and highlighting for you along the way some of the exciting abatement solutions in each sector, and particularly those that could be really pivotal in this transformational decade. So I'll kick off with a bit of a background. So next slide, please, Ronnie. So as was mentioned, the research was nearly a 2-year endeavour and it investigated a range of energy and emissions reducing abatement solutions or potential solutions under a range of different scenarios. The analysis covered the whole economy, which we break into 5 sectors. So that's electricity, buildings, transport, industry, as well as agriculture and land. This project leverages the collective knowledge of ClimateWorks Australia and CSIRO and utilises the newly developed AusTimes model. So this model is a custom localised version of the Times model that is used widely by many around the world, which is developed and maintained as part of the IEA's Energy Technology Systems Analysis Program, or ETSAP. There's much more detail about the AusTimes model, about what it entails, as well as detail on the subsectors from this analysis in the technical report. I've got a link to that a little bit later on. But for now, let's dive into some results. So if I could get the next slide, please. We'll start with electricity. And in this sector, it's all about renewables. These contribute about 75% of generation by 2030 and 100% by 2050 in our scenarios. We know from literature and experts that once you get above about 50% renewable generation, that much more consideration needs to be given to storage and integration technologies like batteries. And whilst batteries and storage aren't explicitly shown here, they definitely play a huge role. Now, these might be chemical batteries, think lithium ion, but this storage could also be serviced by things like solar thermal or perhaps pumped hydro storage too. And in reality, it's probably going to be some mix of a few different options. This renewable generation, which at least in our modelling is primarily composed of solar and wind, are really critical to replace existing fossil fuel generations. And as Amandine mentioned, the speed at which this happens really greatly affects the emissions of all the electricity used across the economy. This is important because not only does it reduce the emissions of things that currently use electricity, but also reduces the emissions of potential new sources of demand due to electrification across the economy. Next slide, please. One of those electrified sectors is buildings, and you'll note how the shape of the curve here actually really closely mirrors that of the electricity sector. Buildings are already highly electrified, but switching to use more electric appliances, those that are rapidly improving in performance and reducing in cost, can really take advantage of the decarbonising electricity grid. Buildings, more importantly, not least, because like my home, like yours, is probably your office and the only place you can go thanks to COVID, but they're important also because they're likely to be the site of a significant share of renewable generation, particularly rooftop solar PV. And going forward, the opportunity to incorporate smarter equipment within our houses, particularly or potentially with electric vehicles in our garages, could further strengthen the role of buildings have in the electricity sector through demand management. But buildings is definitely more than a story about future technology options. There's massive opportunity in improving efficiency and increasing electrification. I've recently moved into a new home, and tell you what, I definitely appreciate the comfort and low energy bills of having an efficient home. And these are things that can really be done right away. Constructing and upgrading buildings to require the least possible energy from the outset and fitting out those buildings with the most efficient equipment will play a huge role in reducing energy use and emissions, particularly in the near term. If I get the next slide. Change gears a little bit now to transport. And our emissions show that near zero emissions by 2050 in transport. And to explain how it could, let me first draw your attention to the graph on the left-hand side, particularly those bottom two blue wedges. So they're road transport emissions, particularly road passenger and road freight. And these transport modes dominate the emissions profile of the transport sector and have traditionally or historically grown very strongly. And I refer you to section 2.3 of the main report for more details on that. So it's in these transport modes where the key abatement is through electrification, be that through battery electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, or autonomous electric vehicles. These all help to reduce emissions from that sector substantially. And while the next decade in particular looks relatively unremarkable in terms of emissions on the left-hand side graph, the cresting of emissions is very significant, particularly because in terms of electric vehicles, where you can see on the right-hand graph, the rate of change in the uptake is very great in that period between 2020 and 2030. So the uptake of those vehicles is helping to offset the growth, and also it's just a matter of replacing the vehicle stock as time goes on. For other transport modes, non-road transport, it's a matter of pursuing alternative fuels such as bioenergy in the second and third generation to reduce emissions there. I'm also particularly excited about the opportunity for electrification. Like we're starting to see some electric small planes, although that's still quite nascent. If I get the next slide. Next slide is on industry. There's quite a bit to cover here, so I'll be spending a little bit of time on this. First, let me draw your attention to the left-hand chart. What this chart shows is how emissions are distributed across the different industrial subsectors. And together, these make up nearly half of Australia's emissions. What else this shows, if you notice the colours of blue within each of the bar, is the diversity of the emission sources. So unlike the last three sectors that we've covered, where the bulk of the emissions are from energy use, industry also has non-energy emissions. So these are fugitive and process emissions arising from production. As you can imagine, these subsectors undertake a wide range of activities, and some are very highly specialised. So the abatement solutions required to reduce emissions vary widely. The emissions trajectory for industry in the modelled scenarios is on the right-hand side chart. And we achieve reductions of at least 79% by 2050. And this is achieved through a number of methods, one of which, a key and a mature solution that does actually cut across all of those sectors, is improving efficiency. Now, this might be your typical behaviour change and an incremental equipment upgrade efficiency improvements. There's also improvements that could be had through the application of artificial intelligence and automation. And we're already seeing that in Australia through the application of autonomous mining trucks that you may be aware of. Efficiency could also be improved through the application of circular economy principles, like increasing the capture rate of scrap steels, enhancing metal recycling, which in turn reduces the need to make new steel that is very energy and emissions intensive. And also transitioning towards materials with lower energy and emissions intensity, such as using different materials for building medium and large buildings, like using cross-laminated timber. There's also scope to utilise new processes. We're seeing the emergence of 3D printing as well, which is one of my pet favourite technologies. This allows for electrification, improved energy efficiency in production, and also of the products that it produces. And electrification more broadly is an incredible opportunity for industry, particularly through electrification of processing and transportation of commodities, as well as in particular manufacturing processes. So nominally these are low and medium grade heat applications, but also through electric arc furnaces for scrap steel production. And an emerging application of electrification is in LNG through the LNG process there. What can't be electrified yet? We'll see the application of the switch of fossil fuels to renewable sources of fuels, particularly for high grade heat, and of course actions to reduce those all important non-energy emissions. So some of those may benefit from a shifting to materials with lower emissions intensity, or otherwise implementing improvements in the production processes themselves, such as catalysts in the production of chemicals, or through the application of CCS. Many of these solutions still face barriers and are very much emerging, so there's definitely room for further investigation on how industrial emissions could reduce even further. And speaking of emerging solutions, one of the single most significant opportunities that we identified for abatement could actually come from agriculture. And that's particularly developing an effective anti-methane vaccine, feed additives, and a suitable delivery mechanism to reduce or near eliminate the non-energy emissions from livestock. The emissions profile of livestock could also be affected by product substitutes that are becoming much more widely available, and also a focus on reducing food waste throughout the supply chain. This doesn't totally remove emissions from the sector. There are some other significant subsectors. And here we see opportunity for sustainable agriculture processes or practices, sorry, that can play a role there, such as fertilizer and manure management. We're also looking at a food and land use in more detail in another project, the Food and Land Use Project, where we'll look at competing demands for land for food and fibre production, as well as to support environmental outcomes, including bioenergy and carbon offsets. So there's more detail there. I might just end on the sectoral run through with a bit of an anecdote. I love planes, I love flying, and when we were setting up this research, I was really keen to include drones somewhere in the analysis. And when we started off, I really thought that would be in transport, perhaps in parcel delivery, but of all places, they cropped up in precision agriculture. So the use of drones to improve yield mapping, undertake selective harvesting, or the variable application of fertilizers. So there is an opportunity for smarts to come in, as is already commonplace in agriculture. So I mentioned a plug to the technical report, and there's a link here. We will be sharing these slides afterwards. So don't fret about typing it into your browser now. The technical report has more detail about the AusTimes model that I mentioned, more detail about the scenarios and the sectoral assumptions as well. And this is meant to go together with the main report. And speaking of the main report, one of the most potentially useful tools for listeners out there are the benchmarks of technology uptake that we have for each sector and some particular technologies. And also in the main report are benchmarks for energy and emissions measures across the sectors, which is on the next slide. And so over to the last of my slides. Just wanted to reiterate that there are many demonstrated and mature solutions that can be deployed across all of the sectors. There are also emerging solutions that we should be supporting the development of to address significant emissions areas. This is a transformational decade and our window for action. So with that, I'll hand back for questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Tom. And Roddy, I might stay on the previous slide for a few concluding remarks as well. Yeah, so I was keen to reflect a bit on this slide, and what do you think when you see it? It's busy, but it's not rocket science. The technologies that are included are well understood now. They don't require radical redesign of life as we know it. They enable us to still live and work in buildings similar to now, travel in vehicles similar to now, consume products similar to now, but to do so without creating emissions. Mostly they replace the energy source with a fuel that doesn't emit, or they substitute the material used for a version that can be made with less emissions. Technology and nature-based solutions can achieve this emissions replacement, but the solutions are not yet being widely purchased and installed, and they need to be at every opportunity. The next decade really matters. To achieve the Paris climate goals, we have to halve our emissions by 2030 at the latest. We now know we have enough technological capacity in the Australian economy to get there, but we need to get these technologies out the door at every opportunity. So what does that take? All in, I mean, it's not just government's job, not just business, not just consumers, but all. It means noticing all the occasions your purchases use emissions and actively requesting the zero emissions alternative from the provider. For governments and businesses with more power, it means the same, as well as using goal-oriented programs to pull through the newer solutions and be the demonstration buyers and standard setters for others. Our scenario benchmarks offer a guide to the scale that these actions should aim for by 2030. The COVID-19 pandemic doesn't change the need for these actions. The equipment that turns back on when the economy restarts will still be using fossil fuels or emitting in the same way as before unless it is upgraded. And yet, the pandemic disruption creates a make or break moment for climate action. The economic shock is causing leaders of every government and business to focus on urgent emergency responses. And there is a huge pressure to bounce back. And this increases the risk that doing things in a climate-friendly way can be overlooked or even deliberately deferred. Yet, at the same time, the huge disruption creates an opportunity to bounce forward, as our former board member Sam Mostyn has said, rather than bounce back. When we wrote the all-in scenario findings for the 1.5 degrees pathway, we saw the scale of the action needed this decade, and it felt like a big ask to catalyze that acceleration in 2020 to achieve those 2030 benchmarks. But the definition of big has been rewritten by the size of the responses from governments to the virus pandemic. If there was ever a time that we could see it's possible to go all in together to bring forward investment in non-zero emission solutions, that time is now. The stimulus to recover from the pandemic will need exactly the sort of actions that are needed to address the climate crisis too. If we get this right, we can meet Australia's international climate change commitments, create jobs in sustainable industries, and set ourselves up for a smoother and speedier shift to a zero emissions economy. The pandemic is causing extraordinary pain and disruption, but it also shows that businesses, individuals, and all levels of government are willing to support each other and work together in response to a crisis. And the measures to address climate change that we identify in this report would not be anything like the economic shock that we're experiencing at the moment. The transition is substantial and affecting workers in declining industries need support. The JobKeeper package shows that government is willing to support people whose jobs become vulnerable due to a global crisis. We can apply that to the climate transition too. The gains are immense in physical impacts of improved human health, saved species and ecosystems, and reduced disaster damage. Plus, Australia has large potential to thrive in a global decarbonised economy, thanks to world-class renewable energy potential, valuable minerals and metals potential, and nature-based solutions potential as well, proximity to Asia. So I'll stop here, and we will now have some time for questions. Over to you, Lilith.
Thanks, Amandine. I'm just waiting to see if Anna has been able to join us to ask some questions. Okay, everyone. Thanks so much. My name's Lilith. I work at ClimateWorks in the communications team. Everyone has been sending some amazing questions, which I'm now going to share with Amandine and Tom.
And Lil, I am here if you can hear me now.
Oh, great. Anna has been able to join us. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Anna to put these questions forward, and hopefully she'll be able to join in on the discussion as well. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone. I can't see you, and I'm not sure that you can see me. So I'm looking forward to helping address some of your questions, and apologies for our technical issues. I'll happily be guided by our staff as to addressing all of these questions, but we've had a series of questions around the pandemic, obviously, and I think Amandine spoke to that in her closing remarks, and I'll invite Amandine to say any more in a moment. There were some technical questions which I'll ask Tom to address around what do we mean when we say no structural change in Australia's economy. Are we talking about the combination of sectors such as oil and gas as a share of GDP? And a related question, can we clarify what we mean by the scenarios? So I might hand over to Amandine or Tom to address those two together.
Sure. So there were a few questions indeed on the pandemic and how it impacts the report's modelling and conclusions. So I think I've already covered most of how the report can be used to support thinking in terms of the economic recovery stimulus package. And on that, there are a number of important elements. Some of them around the fact that deploying the technologies that we've identified at scale can help create jobs immediately, and it can also help foster an increased focus on innovation in Australia, which could lead to the development of new industries and in particular new export markets. So I think these are two elements where there's really big overlap between decarbonisation needs and economic recovery needs. In terms of the other implications of the COVID-19 pandemics and how it would have impacted our report, well, there are some some changes that we would never have thought possible to the scale that we've actually seen them being implemented in the last month. For example, the amount of transport that has now been reduced, and where we've been using video conferencing, such as for this webinar. We have some increase in video conferencing in our report and decreased in transport demand, but not nearly as large as what we are experiencing today. So we would potentially be able to imagine solutions that are even more ambitious than what we've got in the report. Not saying that we probably want to constrain people's ability to travel as much as we're seeing now, but I think it does really show that the world can move very fast and completely change the way in which it's doing things when the circumstances ask for this. In terms of the structural changes to Australia's economy, there was a specific question around the contribution of oil and gas. And this is something that we have indeed looked at in our scenarios. While our modelling focuses on Australia, we have looked at international literature in terms of what would be the future demand for oil and gas and coal in 1.5 and 2 degree worlds. So we have, those are detailed in our reports. We are seeing a slight increase potentially in LNG exports in a 2 degree scenario by 2050, but a strong decrease in a 2 degree world. And it is worth mentioning that there are a number of questions currently being posed in terms of the future role of gas for a number of reasons. One is that, as I mentioned, the curve needs to be steeper towards zero. And that means that potentially we need to move faster towards zero emissions fuels than previously anticipated. And some other elements are around some questions around the emissions intensity of gas production, and especially the growth in fugitive emissions from gas extraction, which in some cases put in question the benefits of gas compared to higher emissions fuels like coal. So I would expect that in the future, some of those international analyses might be refined and see potentially a reduced use of gas further in the future. Coal production in all of our scenarios decreases significantly compared to today, in line with the expectations of 2 and 1.5 degree trajectories globally.
Thanks, Amandine. And so just to summarise that, the person who asked the question asked, are we using a global response for Australia's scenarios in relation to exports? And the answer is yes. Those scenarios that Amandine explained draw on the global expectations of what would be oil and gas use in 2 degree and in 1.5 degree scenarios. And in particular, in relation to LNG, which is one of Australia's exports, there's quite a difference between the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree scenario. As Amandine mentioned, in a 1.5 degree scenario, there is a significant reduction, so less LNG produced and used, and therefore exported by Australia, dramatically less than in the 2 degree scenario. So those details are in our full report, available on the website. I'm going to move to a couple of questions that Tom can address for us. And I'll name all 3 questions, and then Tom, you might address them in a group. The first one is, how do we measure and monitor our progress? How do we know we're on track for each sector? Actually, Tom, I'll leave you with that one, and then we'll move to the agriculture sector.
Thanks, Anna. So in terms of measuring and monitoring our progress, you would have seen in the section that I presented some of those benchmarks for 2030. And these are really key in order to be able to provide signposts along the way of if we are to stay within 2 degrees or indeed 1.5 degrees of warming. These are some potential milestones that we should be looking at across all of the different sectors. So that would be one of the key mechanisms that we know that we could utilise, and not only in terms of energy use or emissions, that could be a little bit one step removed, but also in terms of a number of vehicles on the road, perhaps, to get a really tangible sense. I might also backtrack a little bit and clarify in terms of scenarios. There was a question that came through around what do we mean by that, and are they hypothetical? And the process that we went through to develop the scenarios, and the scenarios that we've got in that we've presented are exploratory in nature. So it's almost, yes, they are hypothetical, and the settings for each were developed based on a desire to explore some of the key material changes, and also the areas of key uncertainty that could exist. And one of those key, and that's exemplified by those triangles that Amandine presented earlier, of what is a contribution of faster technological progress, or more policy, or less policy support, and the like. So they are exploratory and meant to test a few different options.
Thanks, Tom. And in relation to measuring progress, we've shared the benchmarks in the report that we talk about, 2030 benchmarks, to help make it easier for everyone to track progress. That includes policymakers, business leaders, as well as consumers. And we've gone through the detail of each of the sectors and shown what would be the share of usage of each of those technologies in the scenarios where we stay under those temperature limits in the carbon budget. So we hope to have made that much more accessible through this report, and it's now publicly available. Turning now to agriculture, and Amandine may wish to take this next couple of questions. First, Meat and Livestock Australia are targeting red meat production be carbon neutral by 2030 was the question. And the question was asked, from what we've seen, do we think this is realistic? Amandine,
I might actually leave that one to Tom and take on the next one.
Great.
Sure. I mentioned the scenarios and the three aspects of the scenarios: the policy, technology, and businesses and individuals. And here I see that's an example of businesses taking the, or in this case, a business organisation taking the lead in terms of an ambitious abatement target. My expertise is definitely not in red meat production, so I can't speak to the technicalities of it. However, we're seeing this as well through some of the other pledges from organisations that were also earlier up in this slide deck, where organisations are seeking or pledging to reduce or to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And the very fact that they're able to, that they have that on their radar, generally we're able to find the solutions to meet that need or meet that target once that target is set.
That's right. And what struck me in reading our own team's analysis on this agriculture sector was that there are some emerging technologies that can have a massive improvement on agricultural emissions. And one of those that Tom would have discussed is what they call enteric fermentation, which is essentially the methane produced from cattle when they burp. And there is a way to reduce that, either through the combination of how they're fed and what they're fed, and also through a vaccine, so that how they digest food changes, which reduces the methane that they produce. That technology has been proven, but what hasn't been widely demonstrated is, how do you roll that out at scale? How does every cow or every head of livestock get the vaccine? And so if those business models become commercial and viable, and for example, they're trialling drones to do this, then we saw that could halve Australia's agricultural emissions, 40 megatons of savings over the next decade. Really immense gains if that combination of drone technology and the vaccine or the feedstock change can come together in an accessible way. So there is certainly plenty of movement and progress that could be made in this sector. And then there are alternatives to red meat around laboratory meat, which are taking off, but still in the emerging category. And that's certainly one of the things that's motivating the red meat sector to bring itself to carbon neutrality. So that's a bit of a segue to the conversation about carbon forestry. And there's two questions that go together here. What does carbon forestry entail? And in our scenarios, we show, particularly in the 1.5 degree all-in scenario, a very large usage of carbon forestry right up to 2050. Is that possible, and would we run out of land after 2050? So I'm going to ask Amandine to take those two questions together.
Sure, Anna. So in terms of what is carbon forestry, I mean, simply put, it is really planting tree for the primary objective of sequestrating carbon. So it's trees that have properties of sequestering particularly high levels of carbon compared to other species. And in the 1.5C all-in, there is indeed a very large amount of carbon forestry. What is so there's a few different things that I'd like to say. One of them is what we have modeled as carbon forestry. We want to represent any sort of nature-based solution that can support carbon sequestration. It's just that carbon forestry was the one that we were able to model simply. So we're not saying that it should be only carbon forestry. It can be a number of different solutions. The modeling is based on CSIRO's LUTO model, which is a pretty detailed model that takes into account environmental and economic constraints. And what we have using in the 1.5C scenario is actually only about half of the total economic potential that they've identified. So if there's a carbon price that's in line with the global expectations for 2-degree trajectories, then we expect that there could actually be double that amount of carbon forestry in Australia profitably on land. And a lot of the land that is shifted to carbon forestry is land that is currently used for extensive cattle grazing, so not actually displacing a whole lot of food production. There's a few caveats that I need to add to that. One is, as mentioned in the question, when we use carbon forestry, we need to plant new trees every year to keep sequestering carbon. So carbon forestry cannot be a long-term solution. It can really only be an interim, an intermediary solution to buy us time to get to zero emissions in all sectors, because at some point we will run out of land. And there's another element, which is at the moment where there's not been any modeling of Australian food and land use system that really makes us comfortable, completely comfortable that we can use that amount of land for carbon forestry while still meeting food production goals as well as other environmental goals. And this is really the purpose of our Land Use Futures project, which is only at in the first of 3 years initiative, and which will look at what are the comprehensive pathways to a sustainable food and land use system.
Thank you, Amandine. I'm conscious that we are almost at the end of our hour. There was one last question. Well, there were many more questions, actually. This dialogue, this shows us great interest in this topic. Not only did we fill today's allocation on the technology, but we could keep going beyond the hour. So I want to briefly wrap up by noting that we had many more questions, including around the role of public and private sector investment and institutions like the CFC and ARENA. And I've had personal experience of both of those, having been on board of the CFC, which was the Australia's Green Investment Bank, which is still going strong. And I've seen the fabulous work that it does, and it really does make a difference, and it works really well with ARENA and catalyses step change in industry uptake of some of these technologies. So we could speak in much more detail about all of these sectors. So what we have decided to do following today is to run a series of ongoing webinars roughly every fortnight. And we want to invite you to continue to tune into us. We will practice our technology so that we can produce a smooth streaming service for you. And our next one is booked in already for the 13th of May. It's a Wednesday, again at this time, 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And we're delighted to be joined on that occasion by CSIRO's Chief Economist from their Energy Unit, Paul Graham, who we worked really closely with in developing this analysis for Decarbonisation Futures, and also our previous work 5 years ago. And Paul will be joined by another guest panelist from Morgan Stanley, who's Rob Coe, and he's their investment analyst for the energy and utilities sector. And I will look forward to curating a conversation with Paul and Rob for you and any other listeners who wish to make the use of this technology and join us in 2 weeks' time. So following today, you'll receive an email from us with the details of how to register for that. It will have a link to the slides that we shared today, which will also be available on our website, and there'll be a recording as well that's available for sharing as well. And so with 1 minute to go before 4 o'clock, I just want to say a huge thank you, not only to my fabulous staff, Amandine, Denis-Ryan, our Head of National Programs, who oversaw this research, co-authored the report, and led today's presentation, and also Tom Yankos, our Senior Project Manager, who saw the scenario modelling through from beginning to end, and the detailed technology update review, and uncovered so much cool progress in the technologies and helped us knit it together to understand what it means for the nation. We're blessed to have a great team at ClimateWorks of over 50 staff now, all completely dedicated to addressing climate change with the urgency that it requires, and identifying pathways to net zero emissions by 2050. So we hope that today, and through our Decarbonisation Futures work, you now better understand Australia's pathways to net zero emissions, and that it is possible, indeed, by 2050 and before. That means it's doable, but it's still a lot of work. It means moving much faster than we have done, and as you'll see from our all-in scenario, it's everyone's job, not just government, not just business, and not just consumers, but all three together, being much more conscious of every purchase, how it uses emissions, actively requesting the zero emissions alternatives from the provider at the individual level or large business procurement, as well as government. The technology allows us to leapfrog straight to that, and it's up to all of us now to pay more attention and set targets and be standard setters for others, as well as be involved in the coalition building for more goal-oriented programs to pull through the newer solutions that we know can help finish the job. So we hope that we've provided some benchmarks to help guide this and help you understand the scale of the action, but also share our hope that it's achievable. And we're certainly on the brink of a make or break moment now that we're discussing this in the midst of the disruption from the pandemic. So stay tuned and stay with us, and please, we invite you to use all your power to help catalyse action at the right direction and at the right scale. Thank you very much to you all. Thank you, ClimateWorks supporters, our philanthropy supporters, and our program partners are absolutely instrumental to the way we work, and indeed ClimateWorks cannot function as an independent trusted advisor with a dedicated specialist team like we have without the support of philanthropy. So a huge thank you. We're all in this together, and we can see the progress, and we look forward to help catalysing its implementation. See you next time.